Well, thank you very much. Like others at yesterday's masterclass, I was impressed by Claudie Agneret's emphasis on scientific culture, as I would understand it, science in the culture. The arts, classical education in English or French or German literature, can get away with not being useful, but still being respected as a part of our culture. Science has to buy its way into our respect by being useful, and useful, of course, it is, but science is much more than just plain useful. Science is also wonderful, it's beautiful, poetic. Science exploration, space exploration, for example, is sometimes justified because the technology of space has spin-offs, and the most banal of these, the non-stick frying pan, is said to be a spin-off from space technology. Conserving the Amazon rainforest and preserving a rich diversity of species more generally is sometimes justified by the fact that useful medicines can be discovered from the bark of obscure trees in the forest, like aspirin and quinine. But to justify science because of possibly useful spin-offs, like medicines and non-stick frying pans, it's like justifying music because it's good exercise for the violinist's right arm. We appreciate music, even become experts in music, without ever learning to play an instrument. And it's the same with science. We can learn to appreciate science, just as we appreciate a great work of art or music. And that's the main message that I want to convey in this short talk. And I want to make some practical suggestions for aspiring science writers, science communicators. First, obviously, don't dumb down. Science is difficult. It's very often difficult, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort. It's worth the effort on the part of the communicator and the communicatee. Einstein said that we should make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. Don't sugar the pill to the extent that it no longer does the job of conveying the message, of helping people to understand. To understand the staggering fact that each one of us is the product of the acting out of the laws of physics, plus the remarkable process of evolution by natural selection discovered by Darwin. It's one of the great aesthetic experiences that we can have. It should not be watered down, dumbed down, taken down like a Mozart tune used for an advertising jingle. Second principle, obviously, for any communicator, put yourself in the position of the reader. Obviously, this is what all good writers do, whether you're writing on science or anything else. Try to anticipate the difficulties that the reader might have. Possible misunderstandings. How would somebody misunderstand what I've just said? Read it through as though you are seeing it through the eyes of somebody else and try to guess what they might misunderstand, or possible red herrings that might send them off on the wrong track. I find more or less unconsciously when I'm writing, when I'm revising especially, I revise over and over again what I'm writing, and I find more or less unconsciously that I tend to be looking at my stuff through the eyes of some imaginary reader. And I don't do this deliberately. I don't say, today I'm going to look at it through the eyes of so-and-so. It's just that if I happen to have, I don't know, just received a letter from somebody or put down the phone on somebody, I imagine that it's them who's reading my chapter. And immediately I see things which I didn't see before. I see things because I'm looking through their eyes and noticing things that they might misunderstand. Critical thinking was just mentioned by one of the contributors from the audience. We don't only communicate science in order to tell people the facts of science. We're trying to communicate the way scientists think, critical thinking, and all the other things about the way science thinks. We need to recognize that science has its enemies, that science provokes hostility from people who blame science, incredibly blame science for things like the hydrogen bomb. Obviously, if you want to do bad things like build terrible weapons, science is the best way to do it, because science is simply the best way of doing anything. So if you want to do bad things, then science is the best way to do it. But equally, if you want to do good things, then science is the best way to do it. We provoke hostility from religion, and I fear that this is particularly so in my own field of evolutionary biology. There's quite a scandal going on in England at the moment about Islamic students, Muslim students, walking out of people's lectures. These are medical students, boycotting lectures on evolution because the Quran says it's much the same as the book of Genesis. And so we do provoke active hostility from people who are anti-science, and we have to recognize that and work our way around it. Different people have different ways of working their way around it. Some people choose to accommodate and be sympathetic. I would say if somebody boycotted my lectures, good riddance, don't come back. And you're going to fail the exam, by the way. Don't just spout facts. As I said, look at critical thinking, but also try to tell a story. If you're writing about a piece of research, tell it as a story, tell it as a problem that was posed and then which had to be solved. How did they go about solving it? How did solving the first part of the problem lead on to a second question, which then provoked new research? That way, if you tell it as a story, it's gripping. People follow the story. They want to know what happened next. I was once editor of a scientific journal, Animal Behavior, and I tried to encourage the authors to tell their research as a story for exactly that reason. You would be amazed at how many papers get submitted to scientific journals that have absolutely no idea of how gripping it is if you tell it as a story. The standard way of setting out a scientific paper, as you know, is introduction, methods, results, discussion. Well, that's all right. It's a bit boring, but that's the standard way of doing it. I would get papers in which you would have, say, a series of 5 experiments where the logical sequence was that experiment 1 led on to experiment 2, and the result of experiment 2 provoked a new question, which then led on to experiment 3 and then to experiment 4, and so on. Obviously, that would be the right way to communicate that research. But do you know what those people did? Introduction. Methods 1, methods 2, methods 3, methods 4. Results 1, results 2, results 3, results 4. That is literally what they did. Absolutely no idea of how to write it in such a way that it grips the reader. And the point I want to make about this is that the techniques that we use for communicating science to lay people ought to be just the same techniques as we use as scientists to communicate to our professional colleagues. There should not be a rigid separation between how you communicate to your fellow scientists in scientific journals and how you communicate to lay people. If you learn how to communicate to your fellow scientists, if you communicate with them almost as though they were complete laymen, you may surprise yourself by communicating to yourself something about your own work that you didn't previously understand. That method of telling a story where each puzzle leads on to a new question and then that leads on to the next question and so on, I find that useful even for explaining how animals work. For example, in one of the chapters of my book, The Blind Watchmaker, I wanted to explain how bats use echoes to find their way around. Well, I could have just explained how it was done, but instead I I used exactly the same method of telling a story where puzzles lead on to further puzzles, solutions lead on to further puzzles. Bats have a problem: how to find your way around in the dark. How might they solve that problem? Well, they might do it this way, they might do it that way, they might do it the other way. Which would be the best way of solving it? Well, this has something going for it, that has something going for it. Now, finally, we get to how do bats actually solve the problem? They use echoes. That leads on to another question. It's all very well using echoes, but don't you have a problem that the echoes are terribly faint? Yes, you solve that problem by shouting extremely loud, and that's what bats do. But if you shout extremely loud, then you have the danger of deafening yourself, because your loud shrieks are so loud that they damage your ears. All right, then why not shout a bit quieter? Because then you won't hear the echoes. Can't have it both ways. How might this problem be solved? Think of this way of solving it, think of that way of solving it. How do the bats actually solve it? Well, some bats do it by having a little muscle attached to one of the bones in the middle ear, which transmits the sound. And when that muscle is contracted, the bat temporarily deafens itself. So what it does is it pulls that muscle, temporarily deafens itself, shrieks incredibly loudly, and then releases the muscle to undeafen itself just in time to hear the echo, which comes back very faint, of course. And when you think that bats have to do this 50 times a second, you realize what an incredible feat of integrated activity that is. And I went on to raise further problems. How does the bat solve them? Further problems that are raised again. How does the bat solve them? So the exact same technique that you use for communicating how scientists work can also be used for communicating how bats work, and of course any other animal. Use vivid analogies. Well, that's fairly obvious, we often need analogies in order to explain difficult things. In my own field of evolutionary biology, one of the things we need to explain is the sheer immensity of geological time. It's vast. And so various analogies have been proposed, and you've heard people analogizing geological time to the time it takes for a clock to go around. You know, making a 124-hour clock be the whole of geological time. Or the one where you stick your hand out and you say, the middle of my tie is the origin of life, and the tip of my finger is the present. It's all bacteria out to about there. The dinosaurs are about there. Humans come in at the tip of my finger. And the whole of human history, the whole of recorded history, the Egyptians, the pharaohs, the ancient Greeks, the Sumerians, all that falls as the dust from one stroke of the nail file. That brings things into proportion. This session is also about communicating technology, and I've rather neglected technology talking about science. Science is a great aesthetic experience, but even technology is too. I have found myself literally moved to tears when visiting the Mount Wilson Observatory in California and seeing this huge telescope and thinking what that telescope is doing. Or I was moved to tears when I visited the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, looking at this amazing cooperative effort, this international effort of thousands of people all speaking different languages coming together to build this gigantic enterprise in human exploration, one of the finest achievements of the human species. It made me proud to be human. I expressed this poetic feeling of pride in being human in my previous book, The Greatest Show on Earth, about the Large Hadron Collider. And unfortunately, there was a misprint, and it appeared as the Large Hard-On Collider, which rather neutralized the poetry. Unfortunately, the publisher's proofreader spotted the error and removed it. I begged her to put it back in. She said it was more than her job was worth. It's often said that the greatest art and music has sacred inspiration, and nobody who's seen the Sistine Chapel or Notre Dame or heard the St. Matthew Passion could easily laugh off that claim. But, of course, artists have to live, and they go where the money is. They go where they get commissions. And in medieval times, for example, the commissions all came from the church. We shall never know what Bach's oratorio for the expanding universe might have sounded like, or Beethoven's Evolution Symphony. The Nobel Prize for Literature is almost invariably given to a novelist, somebody who writes great literature about things that don't exist or events that never happened. Isn't it about time the Nobel Prize for Literature was given to a scientist? Somebody who writes great literature about things that do exist, things that really do happen in the real world. When you think about it, can you imagine a more worthy vehicle for great poetic literature than the expanding universe? Our galaxy of 100 billion stars, just one of 100 billion galaxies. Or the majestic slow march of geological time and its gradual unfolding in the great diversity of life, culminating in the spectacular firework display of the Cambrian explosion, whose aftermath, 500 million years on, we are part of. Might we send a message to Stockholm from this conference, suggesting in all seriousness that it's high time the Nobel Prize for Literature was given to a scientist? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard, for this fascinating and passionate talks. I just want to ask you to come with us here. You deserve a chair now, of course. Meanwhile, I can inform the audience that you were honored by Time Life as one of the 100 most influential people. Please, here's yours. And Richard Dawkins gets honorary doctorates in both in literature and science. And this is a fascinating point of your personality. His books were translated in more than 45 languages. And now I should mention, and that I was asked in the beginning, that now we have a slide. Our panel is translated in 4 times. I cannot be heard, though I take the microphone. Okay. Everything is happy in the translator cabin, though our panel is translated in 4 languages, French, German, Polish, and English, of course. Not less important is our following panelist, Professor Helga Nowotny. She is president of the European Research Council, a success story of the ongoing 7th Framework Research Program. The first Director General was Professor Winacker. Now the president is Helga Nowotny. She graduated at the Swiss Federal Institute, ETH Zurich. She studied in Columbia University at New York, in Vienna, of course, as well, because she is Austrian, by the way. She is member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Ludwig Millennium University in Munich. She is Royal Member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, and last but not least, member of the Academia Europaea. Her latest book, Christmas coming soon, is called Naked Genes, Reinventing the Human in the Molecular Age. I want a warm welcome for Professor Nowotny.